It happened again. Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton collided in the Italian Grand Prix. This time they both retired on the spot, and this time Verstappen was the one given a penalty, 3 places on the grid for the Russian Grand Prix. Scott Mitchell and Edd Straw are here with me, Glenn Freeman, to discuss the incident and the penalty. Now, Scott, you were in Italy this weekend. You're talking to us from your hotel room. Just tell us, how did the stewards come to their decision, and do you agree with it?
Well, the steward's verdict for this seems to come down entirely to where the cars were positioned as they entered the braking zone for the corner, the first part of the chicane. They've effectively treated the chicane as one complete corner rather than turn 1 being the right-hander and then turn 2 being the left-hander part and being a separate corner. So the reason that's important is because the stewards feel that Verstappen wasn't anywhere near being fully alongside going into the braking zone for the first part of the chicane. And obviously, it's how far alongside you are determines whether you're required to be given racing room. Now, by the time they got to the left-hand part of the chicane, obviously, Max was almost fully alongside Lewis. And in that situation, he has to be given more room. I even felt that Lewis did leave some space, but not enough, and that's why Max ended up clobbering over the curb. But the way the stewards see it is that this all comes back to the entry of the corner. By the time they were contesting the braking zone, Max wasn't fully alongside. So because the corner then goes round to the right, tightens massively, and goes round to the left, the car on the outside is basically going to set up the conditions for an accident if they don't yield, no matter how far they can then subsequently get alongside. I understand what the stewards are trying to say with that logic. Whether I agree with it is a slightly different matter, because I just think in that complex of corners you do have to consider the car's position on the outside the whole way through. That said, when I spoke with Max and with Christian Horner after the race, there was something about their body language, the way they were speaking, which sort of suggested they did feel Max was more at fault. The narrative here was much more, oh no, this was a racing incident. Lewis was squeezing Max. Lewis should have given Max more room. But it's a racing incident, so it doesn't matter. If they genuinely believed Lewis was at fault, I just feel that they would have come at it a lot harder, which made me feel like maybe they know something. Maybe it's, looking at the telemetry. Max's entry speed into the chicane was much higher than normal, and actually the chances of him getting the car slowed down for the second part of the chicane were actually quite slim, which is the main cause of the eventual contact. And actually it turns out that Mercedes, one of Mercedes' senior personnel, Andrew Shovlin, seemed to come to the same interpretation of how the Red Bull hierarchy were talking about the incident in the same way, given how they've gone after Lewis at times this year. This was one that I'd have been happy for it to be chalked up as a racing incident, but if you are going to apportion blame, I can see why you have to apportion it to Max.
And Ed, what about you? Do you feel any differently?
Very similar to Scott's. I would say I'd have been very happy with that being a racing incident. I understand the logic of the stewards, but I do have a little bit of a problem with this question of the right to racing room. That was the phrase that the stewards used, and the way the corner gets broken down, I'm not completely happy with. It was an unusual set of circumstances because Hamilton had just come out of the pits, so that inevitably creates a slightly different dynamic of the two cars relative to each other into the first corner. I think, like a lot of people, I felt both drivers could have played a part in avoiding that happening. I think the fact that it's one of those incidents you have to watch so many times and that has divided opinion. Many drivers have had different opinions on whether that should be a penalty or not. Fernando Alonso felt it was a racing incident, for example, just to name one. So I think it comes down to the question of how hard a line do you want to draw? What grey area do you want to leave in the middle for the point where both drivers contribute a little? What's the threshold for predominantly to blame? It's predominantly or wholly that the stewards have to judge it by. They found Verstappen to be predominantly to blame. Is that 51% or is that 90% to blame? I tend towards quite a high threshold for that. So I understand the rationale behind it and why it was a penalty, but I think the fact that there's so much divided opinion, that it was such a close call, and the fact that the stewards did the almost slightly apologetic 3-place grid drop suggests to me that it was probably a little bit too close in order to make such an emphatic call that it was Verstappen's fault predominantly.
Yeah, I agree with you both in that I think a racing incident would have been fine, but if I had to apportion blame to one driver or the other, I'd be blaming Hamilton. I think Verstappen was entitled to have some space in the second part of that chicane, and Lewis didn't give that to him. But talking of the Mercedes side of things, Ed, Mercedes boss Toto Wolff, before the stewards' verdict came out, he referred to this as perhaps a tactical foul by Verstappen. What do you make of that accusation? Do you think there's any sort of credibility to that theory?
No, it wasn't a tactical foul. A tactical foul implies, well, in football, a player is through on goal or whatever, and you hack them down, you take the cynical approach. What I think did apply in this case is obviously Verstappen knew that he couldn't really afford to have fallen behind Hamilton, because if Hamilton had got ahead, then he wouldn't be caught again. He was going to finish ahead and make a gain in the championship fight. So drivers do balance up these factors when it comes into it. So Verstappen would have known that if the worst did happen and there was a collision, it would actually disadvantage Hamilton a little bit more. But that doesn't mean he steamed into the corner expecting there to be a collision. That's all part of the sort of subconscious decision making and processing that allows the drivers to evaluate the risk versus reward. So yeah, it definitely wasn't tactical or deliberate, but maybe just the conditions and the situation allowed Verstappen to take a slightly larger risk than he otherwise would have done. But that's not a problem. That's all part of the way you weigh up these moves, the way you play the situation and the opponents. So I've got no problem with that at all. But it wasn't deliberate or some kind of tactical foul, no.
And Scott, obviously last time they collided at Silverstone, we asked the question to you and to our audience at the time, will they collide again? So you can probably see where I'm going with this. Now they've collided for a second time. Are we going to see a third collision as this championship ramps up and reaches the decisive moments over the next few races?
Yeah, well, I said after the collision at Silverstone, and I expect it to happen again, and I think it can happen again immediately. But what we saw at Monza was exactly what I expected us to keep seeing, and that isn't necessarily a consequence directly of the fact that they're clashing. It's just they're on the front row and neither of them are giving an inch. So we saw it on the first lap at Monza. Lewis tried to go around the outside of Max into the second chicane. Max gave him basically no room, even on the entry to the corner, let alone halfway round the chicane. They bumped wheels. Lewis aborted, and that is a key difference between how Lewis and Max handled their respective incidents on the outside. Lewis aborted and cut the chicane on the first lap, but that was also partly because he was reacting to contact a little bit earlier in the corner, which didn't happen when Max tried to go around the outside of Lewis, which I guess made Max a little bit braver about going around the outside. So this is the thing, the way the two of them race against one another, the fact that they're so evenly matched, the fact that they're more often than not going to be starting on the same row of the grid, means that we are always going to have quite a high potential for this kind of flashpoint. And I think we're starting to see that Max is a no-compromising driver anyway. And I'm pretty sure now we've got evidence from Silverstone and here that Lewis doesn't feel like, if he's not obliged to leave space, if he doesn't feel like he absolutely has to concede something, he's not going to. Because if he does, he knows that Max is going to take full advantage. So I think the way that we're seeing the battle play out, the way that we're seeing the two personalities play out, and just the simple competitive order of the championship, this is going to keep happening. It's not going to necessarily happen in the way of explosive or spectacular crashes, and hopefully it doesn't lead to anything dangerous, but it will keep happening because they're going to be on track next to each other fighting much more often than not.
Well, there's 8 races scheduled for the rest of the season. They're similar on performance and they're fighting for the World Championship, so their paths are going to cross on track again, aren't they? The phrase that springs to mind is irresistible force meets immovable object. So it's all going to depend on whether either of them modify the way they're going to do things, whether they're willing to give a little bit more racing room to each other, or whether they both double down and the chances are increased. So it's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out. The one thing that we can probably assume is it's not going to happen at Sochi because Verstappen's got a grid penalty. The grid penalty is probably going to be a moot point anyway because chances are he'd have taken a new power unit for that one anyway. But there's so much more racing to come this season. There's going to be a point where they're both going to decide how hard they want to push it and whether they're willing to risk yet another collision. There's every chance it'll happen again.
Well, if it's dependent on one of them giving way in the future, I think we know exactly what's going to happen. So thank you, Ed and Scott, for your insight and opinions. And viewers, make sure you let us know in the comments what you think of the incident and the decision that was taken by the stewards.